We now look at the pluralists. One of the main motivations of the pluralists is the following problem. Parmenides, the philosopher, not the cheese, showed that the assumption of a monistic, a singular world, leads to the conclusion that the world is unchanging and that sense experience is an illusion. And given this implication, some philosophers took the approach of rejecting monism, that there is but one thing, in favor of pluralism, the view that there are more than one kinds of things. There are other approaches as well, but the pluralists, their solution was to reject monism in favor of pluralism. One of these fellows was Empedocles, born in 495, died in 435 BC, and is of course still dead today. He was born in what is now Sicily, and his claim about change was this, that there can be no absolute creation or destruction of the world. So what kind of change is possible then? Well, rejecting the absolute destruction and creation of the world, relative change is still possible in his view. So what are the basic things? Well, instead of one basic thing, like with Thales it being water, for our good dead friend Empedocles, it is the classic four, namely earth, air, fire, and water. And so change is a matter of combining and separation of these four elements. And even had sort of a recipe book. Bone, if you wanted to make bones for some reason, it'd be 2 parts earth and water plus 4 parts fire, and you get bone. I'm not exactly sure how he worked this out, and perhaps I don't want to know how he did so. So that's how things combine. Now, he also had what is called the principle of unification, and this explains how individual elements combine to form these unified objects. And interestingly enough, he claims, similarly to the Beatles, that love is a principle of unity, and that's what brings it all together, really. He also had a principle of individuation, which is, aimed at solving the problem of, obviously, individuation. That is to say, what is it that makes each entity an individual distinct from all others? And this is a long-standing problem in metaphysics. Now, according to Empedocles, this principle explains the basis for there being distinct entities, distinct from and separate from others. And for him, the world is not a single entity, but is composed of numerous individuals. And even though love brings things together, for him, strife is what tears things apart. It is the principle of individuation. A bit more on change. For him, the world was midway between complete unity and total separation. But, like many a pessimist, he believed that the world was heading towards strife, that, to use a bumper sticker slogan, things are becoming worse. Now, he describes these forces as deities, as gods, but he also takes them to be material forces that, to quote him, run through all things like quicksilver. He also had some other views as well, namely the view that there is no empty space, because motion involves objects moving through others, so attempting to solve the earlier problem raised by his predecessors. And he brings forth the theory of sense perception. And this will sound familiar because it's kind of the beginnings of modern theories of sense perception, namely that perception occurs when particles of matter come from objects and strike the sense organs. Now, today, of course, we have a more sophisticated approach to this, but the basic idea is somewhat similar. Namely, there is something, that bounces off from or radiates from an object and has contact with our sense organs. He also, like some other earlier philosophers, developed a theory of evolution, namely that nature creates these creatures randomly, and much like Darwin's much later theory of evolution, those that failed die off, those that succeed live on. So we see the origins of evolution going way back into the way back. A second pluralist is our good dead friend Anaxagoras, which I'm probably horribly mispronouncing. Born in 500 BC, died in 428 BC, and is of course still dead today. He was born in Ionia, moved to Athens, and joined in with an intellectual circle around the famous Athenian politician Pericles. He ended up getting exiled from Athens because he taught that the sun was a white-hot stone and not a god. And of course, later turns out he's kind of right. It's not exactly stone, but definitely not a god. Now, he also was into dissecting stuff. There's a tale that a soothsayer claimed that a one-horned ram given to Pericles would grant him victory in battle. Anaxagoras dissected it and showed that a brain tumor was the cause of the missing horn. And so he ruined that too. No wonder he got exiled. This in some ways foreshadows the trouble that Socrates gets in later, so kind of a precursor to that. So what does pluralism consist of? Well, he claimed that every kind has its own element or seeds, and everything is mixed with everything. So it's a big mix of stuff. So why is a particular thing the thing it is and not other things? Well, his claim is that the predominance of one element makes a thing what it is. So what he's trying to do, to give an example of how his reasoning worked, one very reasonable question is, when we eat food, how do we transform what we eat? Tofu, bacon, or whatever. How does it become us? Which is an excellent question. Now, today, of course, we have some pretty good answers, but back then, it was the time before answers. And what he claimed was that food already contains the seed of flesh, blood, bone, and hair. And so when you eat them, you basically, kind of crudely put, is you have the little parts that you need to make what you're going to make, which in a way is sort of true. I mean, if you break it down to the basic, the basic things like proteins, etc., that is sort of true. Another example, in the case of milk, he claimed that grass already contains seeds of milk, which is how cows are able to produce milk. I guess in a way they kind of, pull the milk out of the grass. Now, he also had a theory of mind, and he introduces this notion of nous, which I'm probably horribly mispronouncing, as a source of motion and a principle of order. This mind doesn't create the world, but is free, spontaneous, active, and all-knowing. And it doesn't seem to be like a ghosty thing, but rather a form of matter, but very rarefied. And so it's still seemingly materialistic, but sort of the introduction of the principle of mind. So why was he important? Well, one thing he served as was an inspirational failure. He tried to present this unified account of reality, did not succeed, but it inspired others to keep on trying, because one of the concerns with it is that his extreme pluralism lacks, going back to our methods of metaphysics, explanatory value, because an explanation is supposed to simplify and unify rather than not do that. Now, he believed that his concept of mind would suffice in these philosophical explanations, but it ends up being kind of a deus ex machina, that it fills in the gaps where his explanations failed, and that this sort of approach will become something that haunts philosophy and science throughout the centuries. For example, much later on, there's a notion of God in the gaps, the idea that if you had a scientific theory and you couldn't explain how it worked, how, say, planetary motion worked, you'd say, well, God's taking care of this. And that, for those who don't think that God is a great explanation, they would find that problematic. So that brings us to the end of the pluralists. They move away from saying it's all just one thing to it's all lots of things.